Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers and to the organizers and to the ICIC for what I think is clearly going to be a great conference. And thank you to the prior speaker and to Saul for what I think was a very interesting and engaging address on the underlying entrepreneurial dynamics and innovation of Israel. Oops, there we go. What I want to talk about today are the underlying drivers and the underlying consequences of innovation clusters in economic performance. We'll talk about the Korean economic challenge, clarify the role of clusters, innovation, and entrepreneurship, talk about cluster policy and economic development going forward, and then talk about how innovation clusters need to play a fundamental role in the future of Korean economic strategy. As Saul mentioned, we are living here in Korea in a miracle. One of the great success stories of the second half of the 20th century has been the emergence of Korea as a developed country starting at an incredibly low level of economic development. Korea is not simply, was not simply a story of the second half of the 20th century, but has continued to be a leader over the last decade. When I was here in 2003, Korea had just recently passed its milestone of $10,000 GDP per capita on a PPP basis. As Saul mentioned in his remarks, South Korea now enjoys far greater than $20,000 of GDP per capita. There is both a high and rising level of prosperity in this environment. Moreover, that growth, that prosperity, isn't simply built on being a low-cost imitator, but instead Korea has established itself as a global innovator. Korea now produces a very high rate of international patents per capita, and perhaps even more strikingly, has had one of the most successful and high growth rates of international patenting per capita of any nation throughout the world. Saul can see the Israeli number just to the left, right there with South Korea over the last decade. Of course, the patenting numbers don't really tell the story, as I think was mentioned earlier. What we want to think about is the process of commercializing new technologies in impactful global ways. And in this is where Korea's clusters come to the fore. Whether or not it's in the automobile industry, in communications, and obviously Samsung and others in the area of cellular telephony, shipbuilding and marine equipment, or the range of activities right where we are in Daejeon. All of these are part of the Korean growth miracle. With all that said, Korea faces a number of significant and difficult challenges. Obviously, over the past 3 years, the entire world has undergone arguably the worst global recession since the 1930s. For Asia, for much of Asia, this was but a smaller event relative to the Asian financial crisis. But as you can see, Korea faced a very significant drop in output, as did many other advanced economies. But over the last 2 years, there's been a hopeful recovery. Not as strong as some would have liked, but certainly far better than we are enjoying in the United States or in much of Europe, though once again, lower than counterparts in China or Taiwan. Interestingly, Korea plays an increasingly global role, not simply of being part of the community of nations, being part of the developed world, but being a leader in the developed world. Korea hosted the G20 recently in one of the most critical economic summits of the past decade. Ultimately, Korea has made enormous progress in transforming itself from an imitator into an emerging innovation-based economy. That performance is grounded in a strong export orientation driven by a group of world-class, globally competitive clusters. And that national evolution as a global innovator reflects leadership by a relatively small number of companies. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. Demographic trends, the erosion of the traditional cost-based competitiveness of the Korean economy, and the perennial security challenges of Korea sharpen the economic growth challenge going forward. Ultimately, as I'll describe in my remarks, Korean economic strategy needs to leverage its cluster strength, enhance competition and entrepreneurship through openness and offering a fertile environment for innovation, and those are going to be required to finalize that transition from an imitator to an innovator, knowledge-based economy. So, to understand Korea's economic challenge, we first have to understand competitiveness. Ultimately, competitiveness is founded first and foremost on obviously our natural endowments, the ability of the kind of underlying cost advantages and location of a particular economy, as well as on macroeconomic competitiveness, the kind of social infrastructure and political institutions that we have, macroeconomic policy at a broad level. But increasingly, particularly in a developed economy, the foundations of competitiveness are microeconomic competitiveness. The quality of the national business environment, the state of cluster development, and the sophistication of companies and operations and strategies. And those all work together and in concert to create a favorable or less favorable environment for globally impactful, globally competitive innovation and commercialization. Ultimately, at the heart of that process are the role of innovation clusters. Clusters are geographic concentration of related companies and associated institutions in a particular field linked by commonalities and complementarities. Clusters are broader than an individual industry, certainly broader than any individual company. They can be clusters of interconnected companies crossing the public and companies and organizations, crossing the public and private divide, linking buyers and sellers, linking consumers to producers, linking universities to firms, linking capital and labor to outcomes. Ultimately, the dynamics of clusters are driven by some core elements of the underlying location. First are the underlying factored input conditions enjoyed by a particular location, whether or not there are high-quality human resources, especially scientific, technical, and managerial personnel, our strong basic research infrastructure, the environment for risk capital, and the information technology infrastructure. At the same time, inputs themselves are not enough. Globally competitive clusters are grounded by a demanding local environment. When you think about it, Milan is not simply the leader, the global leader in fashion. When you visit Milan, it is fashionable, right? You sophisticated and demanding local customers pushing on suppliers to upgrade, to focus on innovation and growth. Of course, if there's only one big firm or one monopoly or a regulation that limits entrepreneurship in the cluster, that's going to be bad for the underlying ability of that cluster to compete on a global basis. The most successful globally competitive clusters are those that encourage investment in innovation-related activity and that have competition that's on the basis of innovation rather than on cost. And finally, while for any individual industry, inputs, demanding customers, and competition are the drivers, the cluster is then surrounded by related and supporting industries that allow any individual company, that allow any individual value chain to be able to realize its value, to be able to create an effective and compelling value proposition and value for consumers. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, right, when you think about the power of clusters in transforming a good idea, Sol's light bulbs, into a globally impactful company, we can think about how to set up the library. 2 students at Stanford University were put on a project of basically how to organize the referencing system of the library, of the Stanford library system. They were 2 very talented computer science students, and they thought of an algorithm which was premised on the idea of having having books that related to each other, and particularly books that were themselves referenced by many other books, appear as the most likely thing that people were looking for. That algorithm, which was a modest, actually a pretty important breakthrough in the underlying computer science of search, didn't just end up as a library project. Instead, precisely because those graduate students were not just at Stanford, but were in an innovation ecosystem in Silicon Valley, they were able to take that idea, the Google PageRank algorithm, and create a company that all of us know. That idea could have very easily just stayed on the library shelf, but instead it went off that shelf and we transformed the light bulb into one of the most important, impactful companies in the global economy. Of course, it's not just about Silicon Valley. I think to get a sense of the power of clusters in shaping economic performance and the role of location, it's useful, sometimes fun, to think about the Australian wine industry. Australia, in some sense, has been put on this earth to make wine. For those of you who have visited Australia, it has a beautiful mountains that surround a large part of the country, filled with endless numbers of valleys, each of which provides exactly the kind of mix for producing various types of wine. Yet, 20 years ago, unless you were really looking for a very bad bottle of wine, you never drank Australian wine. But instead, what happened was that over time, a group of entrepreneurs working with the public sector, working with more established companies, an interesting mix of public and private collaboration, drew upon pre-existing Australian strengths in mining and natural resources, in agriculture and farming, and in essentially the biosciences, in the life sciences, where Australia has, relative to its size, a tremendous comparative advantage. And it was able to bring together, converge those 3 pre-existing clusters to focus tremendous energy, initiative, and entrepreneurship around the wine industry. Interestingly, when the Australians started to make wine, they didn't just simply copy and imitate what was being done in Europe. They didn't just bring over the French wines and simply produce them on Australian soil. Instead, they took a much more scientific and engineering approach towards the production of wine rather than the craft and artist-oriented approach of the Europeans. They developed a number of institutions of collaboration, bringing together public and private in powerful ways that allowed them to study which kinds of grapes and which kind of varieties would work best for the Australian soil. What were the interesting things that they could do to create great wines? That process of experimentation not only generated one of the great growers of wine in the world, a tremendous increase, this is actually in terms of volume, but also the premiums per milliliter have increased over time, creating a tremendous new player on the global wine scene over the past decade and a half. But interestingly, if you get inside the Australian trade statistics, the Australian